Get out of my boardroom. You're senile. My son spat at me in front of the investors. I was 60. I looked at his $50 billion merger and simply said, "Have fun." The next day, the bankers stormed into the office, pale. "You idiot. Your mother holds the 51% majority vote. She just vetoed the deal and fired the entire board." My son froze. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never imagined that the boardroom I helped design would become the stage for my own public execution. The mahogany table stretched before me like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. 23 years I'd sat in meetings in this room, but today felt different. The air conditioning hummed louder than usual, or maybe it was just my nerves making everything seem amplified. The coffee aroma that usually comforted me now made my stomach turn. Keith stood at the head of the table, my son, the CEO of Sterling Solutions, the company I'd built from nothing in my garage 43 years ago. At 41, he commanded the room with the kind of confidence I'd once been proud of. His expensive navy suit fit him perfectly, his hair styled with precision, every inch the successful executive. But the way he looked at me today made my chest tighten. "Gentlemen," Keith announced to the room full of investors and board members, his voice carrying that authoritative tone I'd taught him to use. "Before we proceed with the final details of our $50 billion merger with Morrison Industries, I need to address an uncomfortable situation." My hands gripped the leather arms of my chair. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. Roger Whitman, one of our longest-serving board members, leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk. At 55, he'd always treated me like an old relic who'd overstayed her welcome. Frank Morrison sat beside him, representing the acquiring company, his pale blue eyes studying me with obvious impatience. "As you all know," Keith continued, his gaze settling on me with something that looked disturbingly like pity, "my mother has been struggling to keep up with the complexities of modern business." The words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to speak, but Keith held up his hand. "Please, Mother, let me finish." Mother, not Mom, not even Renee. Mother, like I was some distant relative he was obligated to acknowledge. "The truth is," Keith said, turning to address Frank directly, "she's been becoming increasingly confused about company operations. Yesterday, she suggested we reconsider the merger terms because she thought we were selling too low. She doesn't understand that $50 billion represents the opportunity of a lifetime." Heat rushed to my face. I had suggested reconsidering, not because I was confused, but because I'd actually read the fine print. The merger would gut our employee pension fund and eliminate our profit-sharing program. Programs I'd fought for decades to establish. "Keith," I said quietly, trying to maintain some dignity, "perhaps we could discuss this privately." Roger chuckled, the sound like nails on glass. "See what I mean?" he said to Frank. "She still thinks she has a say in strategic decisions." The humiliation was spreading through me like poison. These men I'd known for years, whose careers I'd helped build, were watching my own son dismantle me piece by piece. Keith's expression softened just enough to look patronizing. "Mother, I know change is hard at your age. You're 65 now, and it's perfectly natural for cognitive function to decline. But this merger is happening with or without your approval." 65. He said it like I was ancient, like reaching 65 meant automatic incompetence. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent building this company while he was sleeping safely in his crib. The sacrifices I'd made, the risks I'd taken, the dreams I'd turned into reality. "I built this company," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the air conditioning. Keith's jaw tightened. "No, Mother. You started a small consulting business. I built this into a $50 billion corporation." The room fell silent. Even Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Get out of my boardroom," Keith said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You're senile, and frankly, you're embarrassing yourself and everyone here." The words echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the downtown skyline. Beyond the glass, the city continued its busy rhythm, oblivious to the fact that my world was crumbling. I stood slowly, my legs shaking slightly. Not from age or frailty, but from the sheer magnitude of betrayal washing over me. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid even when money was tight. "Keith," I said one more time, hoping to find some trace of the child I'd raised in those cold eyes staring back at me. "Security will escort you out if necessary," he replied without emotion. Roger was practically glowing with satisfaction. Frank looked relieved that the old woman problem was being handled efficiently. The other men in the room studied their papers or stared out the windows, pretending not to witness this family destruction. I picked up my purse with hands that weren't quite steady and walked toward the door. Each step felt like I was walking through quicksand. The grandfather clock in the corner, Thomas's clock, the one I'd brought from home when we moved the company to this building, ticked loudly in the silence. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Keith had already moved on, spreading papers across the table, explaining merger timelines to Frank as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just shattered his mother's heart in front of a room full of strangers. "Have fun," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough to make him look up. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or doubt. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I walked out of the boardroom, down the marble hallway I'd walked thousands of times before, past the reception desk where Janet, my former secretary, looked at me with eyes full of sympathy and questions she couldn't ask. The elevator ride down 32 floors felt endless. I studied my reflection in the polished steel doors. 65 years old, silver hair neat in its usual chignon, wearing the navy blazer Thomas had always said brought out my eyes. I didn't look senile. I looked tired, heartbroken, but not senile. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, I stepped out into the autumn afternoon. The October air was crisp against my face, carrying the scent of fallen leaves from the small park across the street. Normal sounds surrounded me: traffic, conversations, the ordinary rhythm of a city at work. But nothing felt normal anymore. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" I stared at the message, then turned off the phone without responding. How could I explain that my son had just stripped away everything I'd worked for, everything I was, in front of a room full of people who'd once respected me? The drive home to Maple Grove Lane was a blur of autumn colors and bitter thoughts. Keith thought he'd won. He thought I was a helpless old woman he could dismiss whenever convenient. But as I pulled into my driveway, past the oak trees Thomas and I had planted when Keith was little, I found myself smiling. A small, quiet smile that would have surprised my son if he'd seen it. There was something Keith didn't know about me. Something no one in that boardroom knew. And tomorrow they were all going to find out exactly who they'd underestimated. That night, I sat in my home office surrounded by ghosts. Thomas's old briefcase sat open on my oak desk, its leather worn soft from decades of use. Inside, yellowed business plans written in his careful handwriting, mixed with my own frantic notes from those early years. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, the same rhythm that had accompanied countless late nights of planning and dreaming. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey and let the familiar ritual calm my nerves. The steam rose from my favorite china cup, the one with tiny roses that Keith had given me for Mother's Day when he was 7. "For the best mommy in the world," the card had said in his crooked handwriting. Where had that little boy gone? I opened my laptop and pulled up the company files I'd been reviewing for weeks. Not the sanitized reports Keith shared with the board, but the real numbers. The ones that showed exactly what this merger would cost our employees. But first, I needed to remember why I was fighting for them at all. The photo album lay open beside my laptop, filled with pictures spanning 4 decades. There was Keith at 6 months old, sleeping peacefully in his crib while I worked at my desk, preparing proposals for clients who insisted on meeting with the man in charge. They'd assumed Thomas was the brain behind Sterling Solutions, never imagining that the quiet woman taking notes was actually the founder. I turned to a picture from 1985, me standing in front of our garage, pregnant with Keith, holding the first contract that would change our lives. Johnson Manufacturing had needed a supply chain consultant, and somehow they'd been desperate enough to hire the woman who'd answered their ad. $25,000 for 6 months of work. It seemed like all the money in the world. Thomas had been so proud that day. "You're going to build something amazing, Renee," he'd said, his arms around my growing belly. "This baby's going to grow up knowing his mother can do anything." The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. I flipped through more pages, watching Keith grow from a toddler playing with toy trucks in my office to a teenager rolling his eyes at my business advice. There were gaps in the photos, periods when I'd been too busy traveling, too consumed with keeping the company afloat, too exhausted to document our lives. Those gaps told their own story. The merger documents spread across my desk painted a clearer picture of Keith's priorities. Morrison Industries wanted our client base and our technology patents. They were willing to pay $50 billion for them. But buried in the fine print were clauses that would eliminate our employee profit-sharing program within 6 months. The pension fund would be restructured, corporate speak for rated. These weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. These were Janet's retirement plans, and Henry's daughter's college fund, and Maria's dreams of buying her first house. People who'd worked for me for decades, who'd built this company alongside me. Keith knew about these clauses. I'd highlighted them in my review and left the documents on his desk 2 weeks ago, along with a note asking for discussion. He'd never responded. My phone buzzed with another text from Janet. "Found something you need to see. Can I come by?" 20 minutes later, Janet sat across from my kitchen table, her face grim. At 58, she'd been with the company for 15 years, working her way up from receptionist to executive assistant. She knew every secret, every struggle, every triumph. "I wasn't supposed to see this," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "But Mr. Keith left his computer unlocked when he went to lunch yesterday." Inside were email exchanges between Keith and Roger, dated over the past 3 months. My heart sank as I read them. "Roger, we need to accelerate Mother's transition out of company involvement. Her questions about the merger are becoming problematic." "Agreed, Keith. Perhaps it's time to discuss conservatorship options." At her age, a few concerned family members could easily establish diminished capacity. "Let's not go that far yet. I think public embarrassment might be more effective. If she's humiliated enough, she might withdraw voluntarily." "Smart thinking. Your mother always was too proud for her own good." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Conservatorship. They'd actually discussed having me declared incompetent. "There's more," Janet said gently. Page 3. Keith's email to a real estate agent dated just last week. "Please prepare market analysis for 15 Maple Grove Lane. We'll need quick sale, probably within 60 days of merger completion. Estate planning purposes." My house. He was planning to sell my house. "Janet," I whispered, "did Keith ever mention what he thinks my role will be after the merger?" She looked uncomfortable. "He's been telling people you'll be moving to a nice assisted living facility, somewhere you can get the care you need." The full picture crystallized with devastating clarity. Keith wasn't just pushing me out of the company, he was erasing me entirely. The merger money would fund his vision of a life where I was safely tucked away, no longer an inconvenience or embarrassment. "Mrs. Sterling," Janet said carefully, "I know this isn't my place, but there has to be something you can do. This company is yours. You built it from nothing. I stared at Thomas's old briefcase, remembering the night he'd died. Cancer had taken him quickly, but he'd lived long enough to see Sterling Solutions go public. I'd held his hand as he made me promise to protect what we'd built together. "Take care of our legacy," he'd whispered. "But more than that, take care of yourself. Keith's young. He'll make mistakes. Don't let him destroy what you sacrificed so much to create." What I'd sacrificed: the missed school plays because I was traveling to client meetings, the family vacations postponed for product launches, the nights I'd worked until dawn while Keith slept, dreaming of the secure future I was building for him. I'd told myself those sacrifices were worth it, that Keith would understand someday, would appreciate what I'd given up for his security. Instead, he saw my dedication as evidence of my failures as a mother. "Janet," I said finally, "I need you to do something for me, but it has to stay between us." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with attention. "I need you to call Margaret Davidson. Tell her I need to see her tomorrow morning. Early." Margaret had been my lawyer for 20 years. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew about the documents Thomas had insisted on creating before his death. Documents that Keith had never seen, had never even suspected existed. "Should I tell her what this is about?" Janet asked. I smiled, and this time it wasn't the quiet, mysterious smile from the boardroom. This was the smile of a woman who'd spent 40 years learning that the most powerful moves were the ones nobody saw coming. "Tell her it's time to remind my son that his mother isn't quite as helpless as he thinks." After Janet left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of Keith's betrayal. The house felt different now. Not like the home I'd lovingly maintained for decades, but like a fortress under siege. I walked through the rooms Thomas and I had filled with dreams and memories. The living room where Keith had taken his first steps. The kitchen where I'd helped him with homework while conference calls played in the background. The garden where he'd helped me plant the roses that still bloomed outside my office window. Keith thought he could erase all of this with a few legal documents and some public humiliation. He thought I was too old, too tired, too beaten down to fight back. But tomorrow morning, Margaret and I were going to show him exactly how wrong he was. Margaret Davidson's law office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same burgundy leather chairs, the same wall of law books that probably cost more than most people's cars, the same faint smell of expensive coffee and old paper. But sitting across from her mahogany desk that morning, everything felt different. At 62, Margaret had the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing lawyers nervous. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck like a weapon waiting to be drawn. She'd been my lawyer since the early days of Sterling Solutions, back when we could barely afford her retainer. "Renee," she said, pouring coffee from an antique silver service. Janet's message was intriguing. She said you need to remind Keith of something he's forgotten. I accepted the delicate china cup, my hands steadier than they'd been in days. "Margaret, I need to know exactly what power I have. The real power, not what Keith thinks I have." She raised an eyebrow and walked to her safe, a massive black steel monument that dominated one corner of the office. The combination lock clicked as she turned it, and I heard the heavy door swing open. "I was wondering when you'd ask about this," she said, returning with a thick manila folder marked Sterling Family Trust, Confidential. My heart started beating faster. Thomas had insisted on creating this trust in the months before he died, but the cancer had progressed so quickly that we'd never had time to fully discuss the details. I'd signed the papers in his hospital room, trusting him completely, focusing more on holding his hand than understanding the legal implications. "Thomas was more worried about Keith than he ever told you," Margaret said gently, opening the folder. "He loved his son, but he also saw his weaknesses, the impulsiveness, the need for approval, the way he'd rather take shortcuts than do the hard work." She spread several documents across the desk. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Irrevocable trust, majority shareholder, sole discretionary authority. Explain this to me like I'm not a businesswoman, I said, even though we both knew I could read a contract as well as anyone. Margaret smiled. Thomas structured everything so that you retain controlling interest in Sterling Solutions through this family trust. On paper, Keith owns 49% of the company outright, but the remaining 51% isn't his. It belongs to the trust, and you are the sole trustee with complete decision-making authority. The words hit me like a physical force. Keith doesn't own the company? Keith has never owned the company. He's been operating as CEO under the assumption that he's the majority shareholder, but legally, you've held controlling interest since Thomas died 18 years ago. I stared at the documents, the black ink blurring as my eyes filled with tears. Not tears of sadness this time, but of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Why didn't Thomas tell me the details? Margaret's expression softened. He was dying, Renee. He trusted you to figure it out when the time was right. He also hoped that time might never come, that Keith would mature into the kind of leader who deserved to inherit what you'd built. I thought about yesterday's humiliation, about Keith's plan to sell my house, about the email discussing conservatorship. That time has come. Indeed it has. Margaret pulled out another document. There's more. The trust also gives you veto power over any major corporate decisions. Mergers, acquisitions, changes to employee benefit structures, executive compensation over $2 million annually. All of it requires your written approval. My hands shook as I reached for the paper. There it was, in black and white. The $50 billion Morrison merger required trustee approval. Keith's signature meant nothing without mine. Margaret, the merger is supposed to be finalized tomorrow. Keith thinks it's a done deal. Is it? She asked, her tone carefully neutral. I thought about the employees who would lose their pensions, about Janet, who'd worked 15 years believing her retirement was secure, about Henry and Maria and dozens of others who'd trusted me to protect what we'd built together. No, I said firmly. It's not. Margaret nodded approvingly. Then we need to move quickly. I'll need to file the appropriate paperwork to make your trustee status official with the SEC and notify Morrison Industries that the merger requires additional approval. That should buy us some time. How long before Keith finds out? Probably this afternoon. The Morrison legal team will contact Sterling's lawyers the moment they receive our filing. A delicious sense of anticipation spread through my chest. Keith had spent yesterday treating me like a doddering old woman who couldn't understand basic business concepts. Today, he was going to discover that his mother held all the cards. There's one more thing, Margaret said, pulling out a sealed envelope marked with Thomas's distinctive handwriting. He asked me to give this to you when you activated the trust. My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Thomas's careful script. My dearest Renee, if you're reading this, it means Keith has forced you to use the power I've given you. I'm sorry it came to this. I'd hoped our son would grow into a man worthy of your sacrifices, but I also knew that might not happen. You gave up so much to build our company and raise our boy. You missed parties and vacations and quiet evenings because you were fighting for our family's future. Keith never understood those sacrifices because I made sure he never had to. Maybe that was my mistake. But now it's time for you to fight for yourself. Use this power not just to protect the company, but to reclaim your own life. You are not too old, not too tired, and certainly not too weak to run what you created. Trust yourself, my love. You always were the stronger one. Forever yours, Thomas. I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my cheeks. Thomas had known. Somehow he'd seen this day coming and had given me the tools I needed to survive it. Renee, Margaret said softly, what do you want to do? I wiped my eyes and looked at her steadily. I want to go to the office. I want to be there when Keith gets the news. That's probably not the best idea legally. It could look like you're trying to ambush him. I'm not ambushing him, I said, standing up with more strength than I'd felt in months. I'm reminding him that his mother isn't the helpless old woman he thinks she is. Margaret gathered the documents into a neat stack. I'll have copies delivered to Keith's office within the hour, along with formal notification that any merger discussions need to include the trustee. I'll also prepare a board resolution recognizing your authority as majority shareholder. And Margaret, I want a complete audit of Keith's decisions over the past year. Every contract, every personnel change, every expense over $10,000. Her eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. Looking for evidence of mismanagement? Looking for evidence that my son has forgotten that running a company isn't a game. 2 hours later, I sat in my car outside the Sterling Solutions building, watching employees hurry in and out through the glass doors. These people had trusted me to build something that would last, that would provide for their families. Keith was willing to sacrifice their security for his own glory. My phone rang, Janet's number. Mrs. Sterling, you need to know, Mr. Keith just got some kind of legal documents. He's been screaming at Roger and Frank for the past 20 minutes. The whole office can hear him. What's he saying? Something about impossible and how this can't be legal. Mrs. Sterling, what did you do? I smiled, watching a young woman struggle with an armload of files as she approached the building. 20 years ago, that had been me, working too hard, dreaming too big, believing that effort and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. I reminded my son that his mother taught him everything he knows about business, I said. But apparently I didn't teach him everything I know. Should I tell him you're here? No, Janet. Let him figure it out himself. He's always been such a smart boy. I'm sure he'll work it out eventually. I hung up and leaned back in my seat, feeling lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow, the Morrison merger would be officially dead. Keith would have to face the consequences of dismissing his mother as a senile old woman, and I would finally reclaim what had always been mine. The girl with the files had made it safely inside. Through the glass windows, I could see Keith pacing in his corner office, gesticulating wildly at Roger and Frank. His face was red with anger and confusion. He was about to learn that underestimating your mother is a mistake you only make once. I wasn't planning to go inside, but when I saw Frank Morrison's black sedan screech into the parking lot, I knew I couldn't miss this. Frank climbed out of his car like a man facing execution, his normally perfect hair disheveled, his tie askew. Behind him came 2 other men in expensive suits, Morrison Industries' legal team, no doubt. Their faces were pale, their movements sharp with barely controlled panic. This was going to be better than I'd imagined. I followed them into the building, keeping my distance. Janet looked up from the reception desk with wide eyes as I approached. Mrs. Sterling, I don't think you should— It's fine, Janet, I said quietly. I have every right to be in my own building. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt different today. Instead of the shame and heartbreak that had weighed me down yesterday, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. The woman reflected in the polished steel doors looked calm, composed, maybe even a little dangerous. The hallway was buzzing with nervous energy. Employees clustered in small groups, whispering urgently. They scattered when they saw me, offering polite nods and confused smiles. Word had clearly gotten out that something major was happening, but no one understood what. I could hear Keith's voice before I reached his office, loud and increasingly frantic. The door was open, and through it I could see Frank pacing near the windows while Keith sat behind his desk, papers scattered across its surface like the aftermath of an explosion. This is impossible, Keith was saying, his voice tight with disbelief. My mother has no legal authority over merger decisions. She's not even on the board of directors anymore. Frank stopped pacing and turned to face him. Keith, I don't care about your family dynamics. What I care about is that Morrison Industries just received official notification that this merger requires approval from the Sterling Family Trust, and that your mother is the sole trustee with veto power. That's ridiculous. I own 60% of this company. Roger, sitting in one of the leather chairs, cleared his throat nervously. Actually, Keith, according to these documents, You own 49%. The rest belongs to a family trust created by your father before he died. The color drained from Keith's face. That's not possible. I've seen the corporate filings. I know exactly what I own. One of Morrison's lawyers stepped forward, consulting a tablet. Mr. Sterling, I'm afraid the filings you've been reviewing show your personal shareholding, not the complete ownership structure. The trust shares were never transferred to your name. Keith stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the papers on his desk, staining the merger documents. Get Margaret Davidson on the phone. Right now. I already spoke with Ms. Davidson, Frank said coldly. She confirmed that Mrs. Renee Sterling has complete discretionary authority over all trust assets and decisions. The merger cannot proceed without her written approval. Then get my mother on the phone. Keith, Roger said carefully, after yesterday's board meeting, I'm not sure she's inclined to take your calls. That's when Keith noticed me standing in the doorway. His face went through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been fear. Mother, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I was just going to call you. There seems to be some confusion about our corporate structure. I stepped into the office, moving slowly, savoring the moment. Frank and his lawyers watched me like I was a dangerous animal that might attack at any moment. Roger shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably remembering yesterday's smug confidence. No confusion, Keith, I said pleasantly. Just information you never bothered to learn. Mother, we need to discuss this privately. Oh, I think we're past private discussions, I replied, settling into the chair facing his desk. After all, you had no problem discussing my alleged incompetence in front of these gentlemen yesterday. Frank stepped forward, his expression desperate. Mrs. Sterling, I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss revised terms for the merger. There won't be a merger, I said simply. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Keith's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't do this, he finally managed. This deal is worth $50 billion. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. For whom? I asked. Certainly not for the 400 employees who will lose their pension benefits. Not for the families who depend on our profit-sharing program. Those are minor details that can be negotiated. I laughed, the sound sharp enough to make Roger flinch. Minor details? Keith, those people built this company alongside me. Their families matter more than your bonus structure. Keith's composure finally cracked. You're being emotional and irrational. This is exactly why I said you weren't capable of making strategic decisions anymore. Emotional, I repeated slowly. Is that what we're calling protecting our employees now? Frank tried again. Mrs. Sterling, perhaps if we could adjust the terms to address your concerns about employee benefits. Mr. Morrison, I said, turning to face him directly. Your company's track record speaks for itself. 3 acquisitions in the past 5 years, and in every case, employee benefits were eliminated within 18 months. Why would this be different? His face flushed red. Those were necessary restructuring decisions. And this is a necessary decision too. The answer is no. Keith slammed his hand on the desk, sending papers flying. You can't destroy everything I've worked for because you're angry about one board meeting. One board meeting? I stood up, feeling my own anger rise. Keith, yesterday you called me senile in front of a room full of people. You told me to get out of my own boardroom. You treated me like a doddering old woman who couldn't understand basic business concepts. I was trying to protect you from... From what? From participating in decisions about the company I built? The company I sacrificed 40 years of my life to create? Roger tried to interrupt. Mrs. Sterling, perhaps we could schedule another meeting when emotions aren't running so high. Emotions, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Mr. Whitman, yesterday you sat in that chair and laughed when my son humiliated me. You said it was a relief that the old woman problem was being handled efficiently. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Roger's face went white. Keith looked between us, confusion replacing anger. Keith, I continued, I know about the emails, the discussions of conservatorship, the plans to sell my house, the assisted living facility you've already researched. How do you... He stopped himself, but it was too late. How do I know? Because unlike you, I still have friends in this company. People who remember what loyalty means. Frank made one last desperate attempt. Mrs. Sterling, if we could just... Mr. Morrison, I said, cutting him off, I suggest you and your team leave now. The merger is dead, and it won't be resurrected. Keith can show you out. Frank's lawyers were already packing their briefcases. The merger they'd spent months negotiating had just evaporated in a single conversation with a woman they'd probably dismissed as irrelevant. This isn't over, Frank said as he headed for the door. Yes, I replied calmly. It is. After Morrison's team left, the office fell silent. Keith sat heavily in his chair, staring at the coffee-stained merger documents. Roger had disappeared, probably to start updating his resume. Mother, Keith said quietly, we need to talk. Now you want to talk, I observed. Yesterday you wanted me escorted out by security. I was protecting the company's interests. No, Keith, you were protecting your own interests. There's a difference. I moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Keith? Tomorrow morning, the board will be meeting to discuss some changes to company leadership. I suggest you prepare accordingly. His head snapped up. What kind of changes? I smiled the same quiet smile I'd worn leaving the boardroom yesterday. The kind that happen when you underestimate your mother. I walked out of his office, down the hallway I'd traveled thousands of times before, past the employees who watched me with new respect and curiosity. This time, I wasn't fleeing in humiliation. I was walking out as what I'd always been, the owner of Sterling Solutions. The elevator doors closed, and I saw my reflection again. The same silver hair, the same navy blazer, but the woman looking back at me was different, stronger, vindicated. Tomorrow, Keith would learn that there were consequences for betraying the person who gave you everything, and I would finally reclaim what had always been mine. The Sterling Solutions boardroom had never felt more like mine than it did that Thursday morning. I arrived early, before 8 o'clock, and took my place at the head of the mahogany table where I belonged. The same chair Keith had dismissed me from just 2 days earlier. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment, I remembered the very first board meeting we'd held in this room, back when Keith was still in college and the company was worth a fraction of what it had become. Janet had prepared everything exactly as I'd requested. Fresh coffee in the silver service, copies of the trust documents at each seat, and a stack of audit reports that would make very interesting reading. She'd also done something I hadn't asked for. She'd placed a single red rose beside my water glass. Thomas's favorite flower. For courage, she'd whispered when she brought it in. Margaret sat to my right, her briefcase open and organized with the precision of someone who'd spent 40 years winning legal battles. She looked like a general preparing for war, which I suppose she was. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. I touched the rose petals gently. I've been ready for 18 years. I just didn't know it. The board members began arriving at exactly 9 o'clock. Roger came in first, looking like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect silver hair was mussed, and his tie hung loose around his neck. He stopped short when he saw me at the head of the table. "Renee," he said carefully, "I wasn't expecting you to attend this meeting." "No," I replied pleasantly. "I imagine you weren't." Frank Morrison's replacement, David Chen, arrived next. Unlike Frank, David had the good sense to look nervous. Morrison Industries had scrambled to send someone to salvage their reputation after yesterday's disaster, but we all knew there was nothing left to salvage. Keith was the last to arrive, and the change in him was startling. Gone was the confident executive who'd humiliated me 2 days ago. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeated slump of his shoulders, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd spent the night realizing his entire world had shifted beneath his feet. He took the seat across from me, the one usually reserved for visiting executives. Not the CEO's chair. That message wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice carrying easily across the room. "Thank you for coming to this emergency board meeting. I know this is unusual, but recent events have made it necessary." Roger cleared his throat. "Renee, before we begin, I think we should address the elephant in the room. The Morrison merger is dead," I finished for him. "Permanently. Mr. Chen, I believe your company has already been notified?" David Chen nodded reluctantly. "Mrs. Sterling, Morrison Industries is prepared to discuss alternative arrangements." "There won't be any arrangements, Mr. Chen. Your company's track record with employee benefits makes any partnership impossible. You can show yourself out." Chen gathered his papers with obvious frustration. "This decision will cost Sterling Solutions billions in lost opportunities." "Mr. Chen," I said, standing slowly, "I've been making business decisions since before you were born. I think I can handle the consequences." After he left, the boardroom fell into uncomfortable silence. Keith stared at his hands, while Roger fidgeted with his pen like a nervous schoolboy. "Now then," I continued, settling back into my chair, "let's discuss the real purpose of this meeting. Margaret?" My lawyer stood and began distributing copies of the audit report. Over the past 18 months, this company has made several questionable decisions under Keith Sterling's leadership. The documentation is quite illuminating. Keith's head snapped up. "What audit? I never authorized any audit." "You didn't need to," I replied calmly. "As majority shareholder and trustee of the Sterling Family Trust, I authorized it. Just like I authorized the review of your compensation package, your expense accounts, and your decision-making process." Roger opened his copy of the report, and I watched his face go white as he read the first page. Keith reached for his own copy with trembling hands. "Some highlights," Margaret continued in her crisp professional tone. "Executive compensation increased by 300% over 18 months. Employee benefit contributions decreased by 25%. Profit-sharing payments delayed by an average of 90 days. And my personal favorite, a company retreat in Aspen that cost $400,000 for 12 executives." Keith's voice was barely a whisper. "Those were standard business expenses." "Standard?" I laughed, the sound echoing off the windows. "Keith, I built this company by staying in Holiday Inns and flying coach. You spent more on wine at that Aspen retreat than we used to spend on annual bonuses for our entire staff." "The business environment is different now." "No, you are different," I cut him off. "The boy I raised understood the value of money because he watched me work 3 jobs to keep us afloat. The man sitting across from me has forgotten where he came from." Roger tried to regain some control of the situation. "Renee, I think we're all letting emotions cloud our judgment. Keith has increased company profits by cutting employee benefits and inflating his own salary," I finished. "Roger, did you know that Keith's annual compensation is now higher than the total payroll for our entire accounting department?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret pulled out another document. "There's more. Keith Sterling has also been in discussions with 3 other merger candidates, all of whom would result in significant employee layoffs. The Branson Group proposal would eliminate 40% of current positions. The Hartwell Industries offer would move operations overseas." Keith finally found his voice. "Those were preliminary discussions, exploratory only." "Exploratory," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Keith, were you planning to explore these options before or after you had me declared incompetent?" His face flushed red. "That was never—" "Roger," I said, turning to face him directly, "would you like to read the email you sent to Keith on October 15th? The one about conservatorship options? Roger's pen fell from his nerveless fingers. Renee, that was taken out of context. Context? I stood up, feeling the full weight of my authority for the first time in years. The context is that you and my son discussed having me declared mentally unfit so you could proceed with your plans without interference. The context is that you laughed when Keith called me senile. The context is that you've both forgotten that I am not some doddering old woman you can dismiss when convenient. Keith tried one more time. Mother, please. We can work this out. Family should stick together. The word family hung in the air like an accusation. Family, I said slowly. Keith, when you planned to sell my house, were you thinking about family? When you researched assisted living facilities without telling me, was that family loyalty? When you humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers, was that how family treats each other? Tears were streaming down his face now, but I felt no sympathy. The time for sympathy had passed when he'd chosen greed over gratitude. Here's what's going to happen, I announced to the room. Effective immediately, I am resuming the role of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Solutions. Keith Sterling is terminated from all positions within the company. You can't do this, Roger protested. Keith has a contract. Keith's contract includes a clause about conduct detrimental to company interests, Margaret said smoothly. Attempting to have the majority shareholder declared incompetent certainly qualifies. I turned to Roger. Mr. Whitman, your services are also no longer required. Your replacement will be announced within the week. Roger sputtered with outrage. This is insane. You can't run this company at your age. You don't understand modern business practices. Roger, I said, my voice deadly quiet. I understand business practices just fine. What I don't understand is how you forgot that I've been successfully running companies since before you graduated law school. Keith suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair. This is my life's work. You can't just take it away. Your life's work? The words came out harder than I'd intended. Keith, I gave birth to you in the same year I incorporated this company. I nursed you while reviewing contracts. I taught you to walk in the hallway outside my first real office. This company isn't your life's work. It's mine. You've just been borrowing it. He stared at me like I was a stranger, which perhaps I was. For too long, I'd been the accommodating mother, the retired founder who stayed out of the way. He'd never met the woman who'd fought tooth and nail to build something from nothing. Security will escort you both out, I continued. Your personal items will be boxed and delivered. Your company credit cards are canceled as of this moment. Your access codes have been changed. Margaret handed Keith a thick envelope. Severance package, standard terms, nothing vindictive. Mrs. Sterling is being more generous than the circumstances warrant. Keith took the envelope with shaking hands. Mother, please. Don't do this. I'm sorry for what I said. I was wrong about the merger. We can fix this. For a moment, looking at his tear-stained face, I almost wavered. This was still my son, the boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. But then I remembered the emails about conservatorship, the plans to sell my house, the complete lack of respect he'd shown not just for me, but for every employee whose life he'd been willing to disrupt for his own benefit. Keith, I said gently, some mistakes can't be fixed. Some trust once broken can't be repaired. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. Security arrived at Margaret's signal. 2 professional men in dark suits who treated the situation with appropriate discretion. Keith walked out under his own power, his shoulders shaking with either rage or grief. Roger followed, still sputtering about lawsuits and wrongful termination. When the boardroom was finally empty except for Margaret and me, I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. How do you feel? Margaret asked. I looked around the room where I'd been humiliated, where I'd been dismissed as irrelevant. The same room where I'd just reclaimed everything that had always been mine. Like I can finally breathe again. 6 months later, I stood in the same boardroom where my son had once called me senile, but everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been professionally cleaned for the first time in years, casting warm light across the mahogany table where 8 new board members sat reviewing quarterly reports. Real reports this time, not the sanitized versions Keith used to present. Numbers that showed a company not just surviving, but thriving. Employee satisfaction is up 37% since January, Janet reported from her new position as Director of Human Resources. At 58, she'd finally gotten the promotion she deserved for years. The restored profit-sharing program and pension contributions have been extremely well received. Henry Morrison, our new Chief Financial Officer, no relation to Frank Morrison, thankfully, nodded approvingly. The financial impact has been minimal. Employee productivity has increased enough to offset the additional benefit costs. I smiled, remembering how Keith had insisted these programs were unnecessary luxuries. Funny how treating people well actually improved business performance. Who could have predicted that? What about the Hartwell partnership? Asked Sarah Chen, our youngest board member at 34. I'd promoted her from senior analyst after discovering that Keith had been ignoring her innovative market research for months. Moving forward as planned, I replied. But unlike Keith's approach, we're maintaining full employment. No layoffs, no benefit cuts. Hartwell was initially resistant, but when I explained that our employees are our greatest asset, they understood. The irony wasn't lost on me. Keith had been so focused on finding buyers for the company that he'd never considered selective partnerships that would strengthen rather than dismantle what we'd built. After the meeting, I retreated to my office. Keith's old corner office, actually. I'd moved back into the space I'd occupied for 20 years before stepping aside from my son. The view of the city skyline was spectacular, but what I loved most was the framed photo on my desk. Thomas and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and ready to conquer the world together. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Sterling," Janet's voice came through. "You have a visitor. He doesn't have an appointment, but—" I knew without asking. I'd been expecting this visit for weeks. Keith looked older than his 41 years as he sat across from my desk. His expensive suits had been replaced by khakis and a button-down shirt. His hair was longer, less perfectly styled. The arrogant confidence that had once defined him was nowhere to be seen. "Hello, Mother," he said quietly. "Keith." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I heard you found a new position." He nodded. "Regional sales manager at Brennan Industries. It's a significant change from what I'm used to." Brennan Industries was a mid-sized company that paid about a quarter of what Keith had been earning at Sterling Solutions. No expense accounts, no company car, no executive perks. Just honest work for honest pay. "How are you adjusting?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My new boss is 26 years old. She has an MBA from a state school and calls me Keith, not Mr. Sterling. Yesterday, she asked me to reorganize the supply closet because she said I needed to understand all aspects of the business." "And did you? Reorganize the supply closet?" He looked surprised by the question. "Yes, it took 3 hours, and I found inventory tracking errors worth thousands of dollars. Turns out there's value in understanding the details." I nodded approvingly. "Your father used to say that a good executive should be able to do any job in the company if necessary." "I never listened to those stories," Keith admitted. "I thought they were just old-fashioned nonsense." We sat in silence for a moment. Through the windows, I could see people on the street below, rushing to meetings, carrying coffee, living their busy lives. 6 months ago, I'd been one of those people, hurrying past the building that housed the company I'd created, no longer welcome in my own boardroom. "I came to apologize," Keith said finally. "Not to ask for my job back or to make excuses, just to say I'm sorry." "For what, specifically?" He flinched at the direct question. "For calling you senile, for treating you like you were incompetent, for planning to have you declared unfit. His voice broke on the last words. And? For forgetting everything you sacrificed to build this company. For taking your love for granted. For being so focused on my own ambitions that I lost sight of what really mattered. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity. But Keith had never been a good liar, and what I saw was genuine remorse. "I've been seeing a therapist," he continued. "Dr. Williams downtown. She's been helping me understand how I became the kind of person who could treat his own mother so cruelly." "And what have you learned?" He took a shaky breath. "That success without character is just expensive failure. That you can't build anything lasting on a foundation of selfishness and disrespect. That I spent so many years trying to prove I was worthy of what you built that I forgot to be worthy of who you are." The words were exactly what I'd longed to hear for months, but they couldn't erase the damage that had been done. The trust between us had been shattered, and trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. "Keith," I said gently, "I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you're learning to see things differently. But an apology doesn't undo the choices you made." "I know." Tears were streaming down his face now. "I know I can't fix this. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Not just the company or the money or the position. I lost you. I lost the respect of the person whose opinion mattered most." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I was going to have this delivered to your apartment, but since you're here." Keith unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a photo from his college graduation. Him in his cap and gown, me standing beside him with pride radiating from my face. We looked happy. We looked like family. "I want you to have this," I said. "Not because I forgive everything, but because I want you to remember that person you were before ambition and greed changed you." He held the photo like it was made of glass. Do you think there's any chance we could rebuild our relationship someday?" The question I'd been dreading. The one I'd been asking myself for months. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Right now, I need time to heal from what happened. And you need time to prove that the changes you're making are real, not just convenient." Keith nodded, wiping his eyes. "If I could do it over." "But you can't," I said firmly. "None of us can. We can only move forward and try to do better." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Mother, for what it's worth, the company looks incredible. Everything you've done in the past 6 months, the employee programs, the new partnerships, the growth strategy, it's brilliant. Dad would be so proud." After he left, I sat alone in my office as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carpet. The photo he'd given back to me sat on my desk next to the one of Thomas and me. 2 different versions of happiness, separated by decades of choices and consequences. My computer chimed with a new email from Sarah Chen, confirming that the Peterson Industries partnership had been finalized. Another company that wanted to work with us because of our reputation for integrity and employee treatment, not because they wanted to strip us for parts. I thought about Keith, starting over at 41, learning humility from a boss young enough to be his daughter. It wouldn't be easy for him, but maybe that was exactly what he needed. Maybe real character could only be built through real struggle. Margaret knocked on my doorframe. "How are you doing?" "Better," I said, and realized it was true. Much better. "Any regrets about Keith?" I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, the thought of firing my own son would have been unimaginable. Now, looking at the quarterly reports that showed every department thriving, at the employee satisfaction surveys that revealed genuine excitement about the company's direction, at the new partnerships built on mutual respect rather than predatory acquisition, I knew I'd made the right choice. "No," I said finally. "No regrets." That evening I drove home to Maple Grove Lane, past the oak trees that had grown tall and strong over the decades. My house, still my house despite Keith's plans, looked warm and welcoming in the twilight. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey and sat in Thomas's old chair, looking out at the garden we'd planted together 40 years ago. The roses were blooming, their red petals bright against the green foliage. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Happy anniversary, boss. 1 year since you incorporated Sterling Solutions. Here's to 40 more." I smiled, realizing she was right. It had been exactly 41 years since I'd filed the paperwork to make Sterling Solutions official. 4 decades of building, struggling, growing, and finally reclaiming what had always been mine. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to Thomas, who'd given me the tools I needed to protect our legacy, to Janet and the employees who'd remained loyal when loyalty seemed pointless, to Margaret, who'd helped me remember my own strength, and even to Keith, who'd inadvertently taught me that sometimes you have to lose everything to remember who you really are. At 65, I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. The roses outside my window swayed gently in the evening breeze, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I had work to do, a company to run, and employees to protect. But most importantly, I had finally reclaimed not just my business, but myself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new decisions to make. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. In my own home, in my own life, surrounded by the fruits of 4 decades of hard work and determination. Keith had called me senile, but I'd proven that age is just experience in disguise. And experience, it turns out, is the most powerful weapon of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.